What happens when the person who knows what happened to your daughter stands right in front of you, smiling, untouchable, protected by a system designed to shield diplomats from consequences? June 2010. A 21-year-old woman walks into a party in Dubai and never walks out. The police know who was there. They know what happened. But for 14 years, they can't touch him because he has something more powerful than innocence. Diplomatic immunity, until now. This is the story of Naomi Clarke, the party that destroyed a family, and the one mother who refused to let power silence justice. Naomi Clarke was 21 years old when she boarded the flight to Dubai with her three closest friends from King's College London. She had just finished her degree in art history, and this trip was supposed to be a celebration, a reward for 3 years of studying paintings and sculptures that told stories of lives long finished. Her own story was about to end in a way no one could have predicted, in a place where wealth and power created their own laws. Maya Bennett, Ellie Harrison, and Roxanne Carter had been planning this trip for months. They stayed at a modest hotel near Jumeirah Beach. Nothing extravagant, but close enough to the glittering towers that defined Dubai in 2010. For 4 days, they wandered through shopping malls with indoor ski slopes, took photographs in front of the Burj Khalifa, and laughed over cocktails that cost more than their weekly grocery budget. They were young, they were free, and they believed the world was theirs without consequence. On the fourth night, Roxanne was scrolling through Instagram when she found a post from an account called Dubai Elite Circles, an exclusive party at a private villa on the Palm Jumeirah, celebrity DJs, VIP guests, attendance by invitation only. Within minutes, all 4 of them had sent requests. The account responded almost immediately. They were in. What they didn't know was that this invitation would be the last decision Naomi would ever make. Naomi wore a white linen dress she had bought in a Dubai market, simple but elegant, hair tied back in a low bun. Before leaving the hotel, she sent her mother, Clara, a text message. Brief, just a few words about the party and a promise to call the next day. Clara read it while making tea in her kitchen in Brixton, smiled, and went to bed thinking her daughter was having the time of her life. That message would be the last communication she would ever receive from Naomi. The villa was located at the far end of the Palm Jumeirah, separated by wide stretches of road and tall gates that ensured complete privacy. When their taxi arrived, they found themselves standing in front of a massive white structure with floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with warm light. Music pulsed from inside. Well-dressed people moved through the open courtyard, drinks in hand, laughter echoing into the night air. They walked through the entrance together, phones already out, snapping photos of marble floors, chandeliers, an infinity pool stretching toward the dark expanse of the Arabian Gulf. For the first hour, everything felt surreal but harmless. Cocktails passed around by servers in black uniforms, a DJ booth near the pool, clusters of people speaking different languages. Naomi stayed close to her friends, sipping slowly, taking in the scene with fascination and unease. She noticed many guests seemed older, more polished, more connected. Men in tailored suits speaking on phones with authority, women in designer dresses moving with the confidence of belonging. Naomi felt out of place, but she told herself it was just nerves. Around midnight, Naomi told her friends she needed the bathroom. She had been nursing the same cocktail for over an hour and wanted to step away from the noise. Maya offered to come, but Naomi waved her off, saying she would be quick. She walked through the villa, past groups laughing and talking, past a room where a poker game was in full swing, past hallways lined with abstract art that reminded her of galleries in London. She found a bathroom near the back of the house, locked the door, and took a breath. When she stepped out 5 minutes later, the hallway was empty. The music seemed distant now, muffled by thick walls and closed doors. Naomi turned to head back, but as she passed one of the rooms, she heard voices. Not party voices, but something sharper, more intense. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see silhouettes of 2 men standing close, one speaking in rapid, clipped sentences. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. An argument or negotiation, something not meant to be overheard. Naomi should have kept walking. Every instinct told her to turn around, rejoin her friends, leave the villa. But curiosity made her pause just a moment too long. One of the men turned his head and their eyes met. Naomi's heart stuttered. She saw his face clearly, a young man perhaps a few years older than her, sharp features, an expression that shifted from surprise to something colder, something calculating. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and walked quickly back toward the main party, pulse racing, mind telling her she had just made a mistake. When Naomi found her friends near the pool, she was pale, visibly shaken. Maya noticed immediately and asked if she was okay. Naomi nodded, but her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She told Maya she wanted to leave, that something about the party felt wrong, that they should go back to the hotel. Maya agreed without question, and the four began gathering their things. But before they could leave, a man approached them, tall, well-dressed, speaking with the easy charm of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He introduced himself only as a friend of the host and said there was a smaller gathering in another part of the villa, something more intimate, more exclusive. He looked directly at Naomi as he spoke, and she felt a chill run through her. She shook her head and said they were leaving, but the man persisted, placing a hand lightly on her arm, insisting it would only be for a few minutes. Naomi pulled her arm away and told him firmly they were going. Her friends moved closer, forming a protective circle, and the man finally stepped back, holding up his hands in mock surrender. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. As they walked toward the exit, Naomi felt his eyes following her. They made it to the front gate where Maya called a taxi. Estimated arrival 8 minutes. They stood on the street away from the music and lights, waiting in warm night air. Naomi was quiet, staring at her phone, scrolling through nothing. Ellie asked if she wanted to talk about what happened, but Naomi just shook her head and said she would explain later, once they were back at the hotel. The taxi arrived. Maya, Ellie, and Roxanne climbed into the back seat. Naomi was about to follow when she realized she had left her small purse inside the villa, near the pool area where they had been sitting. She cursed under her breath and told her friends to wait, that she would be right back. Maya offered to go with her, but Naomi insisted it would take less than a minute, that the purse was just sitting on a table, easy to grab. She walked back through the gate, back into the villa, and disappeared into the crowd. Her friends waited in the taxi, the driver growing impatient, the meter running. After 5 minutes, Maya sent a text. After 10 minutes, she called. The phone rang, but there was no answer. After 15 minutes, Maya, Ellie, and Roxanne got out and went back into the villa. They searched the pool area, the main rooms, the hallways. They asked other guests if they had seen a young woman in a white dress, but most people were too intoxicated or too disinterested to remember. They found the table where they had been sitting earlier, but there was no purse, no sign Naomi had ever returned. Panic set in. Maya approached one of the servers and asked if there was a host they could speak to, someone in charge. But the server looked confused and said he didn't know who had organized the party. Roxanne tried calling Naomi's phone again and again, but each time it went straight to voicemail. By 2 in the morning, they made the decision to go to the police. The nearest police station was in central Dubai, a sleek modern building designed to project authority and efficiency. Maya, Ellie, and Roxanne walked in together, exhausted and terrified, trying to explain what had happened. The officer at the desk listened with a detached expression, taking notes in Arabic, occasionally glancing up with barely concealed impatience. He asked for Naomi's full name, passport number, a description of what she was wearing. He asked if they were sure she hadn't simply left with someone, if she had a boyfriend, if there was any reason she might have wanted to disappear. The implication was clear, and it made Maya's blood boil. She raised her voice, insisting Naomi would never do that, that something was wrong, that they needed to send officers to the villa immediately. The officer told them to calm down, that they would file a report, that someone would follow up in the morning. Morning came, and nothing happened. The 3 women returned demanding updates, demanding action. They were told officers had visited the villa and found nothing unusual, that the property was owned by a private company and had been rented for the evening, that there was no record of who had organized the party or who had been in attendance. The villa had been cleaned, guests dispersed, no witnesses willing to come forward. By the 3rd day, Naomi's mother, Clarke, was on a plane to Dubai. She had spent the previous 48 hours in controlled panic, calling the British embassy, calling Dubai police, calling anyone who might help. The embassy was polite but largely unhelpful, explaining they could offer support, but had no jurisdiction over local investigations. Clara arrived and went straight to the police station where she demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had a presence that commanded attention. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She spoke clearly and firmly, laying out everything she knew, and she made it abundantly clear she wasn't leaving Dubai until she had answers. The lead investigator was Lieutenant Rashid Al-Mansouri, early 40s, graying hair, tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. He met with Clara in a small office and listened as she recounted the events. When she finished, he leaned back and told her in careful English they were doing everything they could. Clara looked at him and said she didn't believe him. She asked why no one had interviewed the party guests, why no one had tracked down who sent the invitation, why no one seemed to care that a young woman had vanished without trace. Lieutenant Al-Mansouri's expression didn't change. He told her the investigation was ongoing, these things took time, and she should return to London and wait for updates. Clara didn't return to London. She stayed in Dubai for 2 weeks, going to the police station every single day, calling the embassy, calling journalists, calling anyone who would listen. She hired a private investigator, a former police officer named David Hassan, who had moved to Dubai years earlier and knew how the system worked. David began asking questions, digging into party details, trying to identify guests who had been there. What he found was a wall of silence. No one wanted to talk. The few people he tracked down claimed they didn't remember seeing Naomi, didn't remember anything unusual, had no idea who organized the event. It was as if the party had never happened, as if Naomi had simply evaporated into desert air. But David found one piece of information that changed everything. Through a contact in the hospitality industry, he learned the villa was frequently used by high-ranking diplomats and their families. Not officially listed as a diplomatic residence, but known among certain circles as a place where people with connections could host private events without attracting attention. David passed this to Clara, and she immediately understood what it meant. If diplomats were involved, if people with immunity were present that night, the investigation was never going anywhere. The system was designed to protect them, and Naomi's disappearance was just collateral damage. Clara confronted Lieutenant Al-Mansouri with this information, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but something close. He told her in a quiet voice there were certain cases beyond his control, certain people who couldn't be questioned, certain doors that would never open no matter how hard he pushed. He didn't say the words diplomatic immunity, but he didn't need to. Clara understood. She asked if he was telling her that her daughter's life mattered less than protecting someone's political career. Lieutenant Al-Mansouri didn't answer. He simply looked down at the file on his desk, and Clara knew she had lost. She returned to London 2 weeks later, broken but not defeated. She set up a website dedicated to Naomi's case, posted every detail, every photograph, every timeline. She contacted journalists, appeared on news programs, gave interviews to anyone who would listen. For a few weeks, the story gained traction. Articles in British newspapers, segments on morning talk shows, social media campaigns with hashtags like Justice for Naomi and Find Naomi Clarke. But as weeks turned to months, attention faded. News stories took over the news cycle, and Naomi's disappearance became just another tragic mystery, another unsolved case filed away in a drawer somewhere. Clara didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every year on the anniversary of Naomi's disappearance, she held a vigil in Brixton where she and Naomi had lived. Friends, neighbors, strangers would gather, holding candles, sharing memories, keeping Naomi's name alive. Clara also continued working with David Hassan, who remained in Dubai continuing his quiet investigation. He couldn't get access to official records, couldn't force anyone to talk, but he kept his ear to the ground, waiting for the moment when someone might slip, when the wall of silence might crack. Years passed, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. Naomi's friends graduated, found jobs, got married, moved on with their lives. Maya became a teacher in Manchester. Ellie moved to Australia and rarely spoke about Dubai. Roxanne struggled with guilt and depression, seeing a therapist twice a week, unable to shake the feeling she was responsible. Clara aged in a way that had nothing to do with time. Her hair turned gray, lines deepened around her eyes, and she developed a permanent tension in her shoulders, as if carrying the weight of her daughter's absence every single day. In 2015, David Hassan sent Clara a message that stopped her heart. He had found something. Through a contact in the diplomatic community, he learned the name of one of the men at the party that night. The man was the son of a senior diplomat from a European country, someone stationed in Dubai at the time. David didn't have proof this man was involved in Naomi's disappearance, but he had confirmation he'd been at the villa, had spoken to Naomi, and had left Dubai less than a week after she vanished. His name was Adrian Close, and he was now living in Vienna, working for his country's foreign ministry. Clara wanted to fly to Vienna immediately to confront him, to demand answers, but David warned her it would be pointless. Adrian Close still had diplomatic immunity. Even if Clara stood in front of him and accused him to his face, there was nothing she could do. He couldn't be arrested, couldn't be questioned, couldn't be touched. The law protected him completely. Clara felt rage and helplessness rise in her chest, threatening to choke her. She had a name, she had a face, she had proof this man had been there, and yet she was powerless. She didn't give up. She contacted human rights organizations, wrote letters to members of parliament, reached out to journalists who specialized in diplomatic scandals. A few articles were published raising questions about diplomatic immunity and whether it should apply in serious crimes. But nothing changed. Adrian Close continued his career, moving from Vienna to Brussels, then to Geneva, always protected, always untouchable. Then in 2024, something shifted. David Hassan sent Clara a message that made her heart stop. Adrian Close's diplomatic career was over. He had resigned from his position in the foreign ministry and was now living as a private citizen in Munich. For the first time in 14 years, he no longer had diplomatic immunity. He was no longer protected. He could be questioned, he could be arrested. Clara immediately contacted British police, who forwarded information to Interpol. Within days, a formal request was made to German authorities to interview Adrian Close in connection with Naomi Clarke's disappearance. German police brought Adrian in for questioning in March 2024. He arrived with a lawyer, composed and calm, insisting he had nothing to do with Naomi's disappearance. But investigators had more than suspicions. David Hassan had spent years gathering evidence, small pieces that, when put together, painted a damning picture. Phone records showing Adrian made several calls to a local fixer in Dubai the night Naomi disappeared. Financial records showing a large cash withdrawal the following day. Witness statements from people at the party, people no longer afraid to talk now that diplomatic protections had been lifted. Under pressure, Adrian's story began to crack. He admitted he'd been at the party. He admitted he'd spoken to Naomi. He admitted there had been an argument, that Naomi had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, that things had escalated. He claimed it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for anything to happen, that he'd panicked. He said others at the party helped him cover it up, that a boat had been arranged, that Naomi's body had been taken far out into the Arabian Gulf and disposed of. He didn't know exactly where. He hadn't been on the boat. He had just paid for it to be done. The confession sent shockwaves through the international community. Diplomatic immunity had shielded a man involved in the death of a young woman for over a decade. Clara Clarke's 14-year fight for justice had finally, agonizingly, led to the truth. But the truth brought no comfort. Naomi was still gone. Her body was still somewhere in the ocean, unreachable, unrecoverable. Clara had spent 14 years hoping for a miracle, hoping Naomi might somehow still be alive, and now that hope was extinguished forever. In May 2024, a deep-sea salvage operation was launched in the Arabian Gulf based on coordinates Adrian provided. The search took weeks. Divers combed the ocean floor using sonar and underwater cameras to scan for any sign of human remains. On June 10, 2024, almost exactly 14 years after Naomi disappeared, they found her. Her body had been weighted down and dumped in a shipping lane, but over time the weights had corroded and shifted, allowing her remains to drift. She was identified through dental records and day testing. Clara flew to Dubai one final time, not to search but to bring her daughter home. Authorities released Naomi's remains, and Clara arranged for her body to be cremated and brought back to London. A funeral was held in Brixton, attended by hundreds. Many who had never met Naomi but had followed her story, had watched Clara's fight, had been moved by her refusal to let her daughter be forgotten. Adrian Close was arrested and charged with manslaughter and obstruction of justice. His trial began in Munich on November 4, 2024, in a courtroom packed with journalists, human rights observers, and members of Naomi's family. Clara sat in the front row every single day, hands folded in her lap, eyes never leaving Adrian's face. She had waited 14 years for this moment, and she wasn't going to miss a second of it. The prosecution opened with a detailed timeline of the night Naomi disappeared. They presented photographs of the villa, floor plans, testimony from Maya, Ellie, and Roxanne, who had flown to Munich to testify. Maya broke down on the stand describing waiting in the taxi, calling Naomi's phone over and over, hearing it ring and ring with no answer. She said she had replayed that night thousands of times, wondering what would have happened if she had insisted on going back into the villa with Naomi. The prosecutor gently reminded her none of this was her fault, but Maya shook her head, tears streaming, and said it didn't matter. She would carry the guilt for the rest of her life. Ellie testified next, describing the man who had approached them near the pool, the man who tried to convince them to stay for the smaller exclusive gathering. She said she had seen Adrian Close in photographs online after his name was released, and she was certain he was the same man. She described the way he looked at Naomi, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, the way he placed his hand on Naomi's arm in a gesture that looked friendly but felt threatening. The defense attorney tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting 14 years had passed and memory was unreliable. But Ellie didn't waver. She said some faces you never forget, especially when they belong to the last person who tried to stop your friend from leaving. David Hassan took the stand and presented his findings with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed this case for years. He explained how he tracked down former staff from the villa, people too afraid to speak in 2010, but willing to talk now. One of them, a housekeeper named Amira, testified in a pre-recorded deposition that she'd been working the night of the party and had seen Adrian arguing with a young woman in a white dress near the back of the villa. She said the argument had been intense, that the woman tried to walk away, but Adrian grabbed her arm and pulled her into one of the private rooms. Amira had been told by her supervisor to leave the area and not ask questions. She obeyed because she needed the job, but the image of that young woman's frightened face haunted her for years. David also presented phone records showing Adrian made 3 calls to a man named Tariq Al-Fahim in the hours after Naomi disappeared. Tariq was known in certain circles as a fixer, someone who could make problems disappear for the right price. He'd been investigated multiple times by Dubai authorities but never charged. David tried to track him down, but Tariq vanished in 2016 and no one knew where he was. The prosecution argued Adrian hired Tariq to dispose of Naomi's body, and financial records supported this. A cash withdrawal of 50,000 euros was made from Adrian's account 2 days after Naomi disappeared, far more than a young diplomat would normally need. The defense argued the evidence was circumstantial, no direct proof Adrian harmed Naomi, that the confession was coerced. But prosecution countered with forensic evidence from Naomi's remains. Despite being submerged in seawater for over a decade, forensic experts extracted traces of DNA from beneath Naomi's fingernails. The DNA matched Adrian Close. The defense had no explanation. They tried to suggest contamination, mishandling of evidence, but the forensic team had followed every protocol and chain of custody was airtight. Adrian took the stand in his own defense, and for the first time, Clara heard him speak at length. He was composed, almost detached, as if discussing something that happened to someone else. He admitted he'd been at the party, spoken to Naomi, that there'd been an argument, but he claimed it wasn't what prosecution was making it. He said Naomi walked into a room where a private business meeting was taking place, that she overheard things that were sensitive, that he simply tried to explain she needed to keep what she heard confidential. He said she became upset, accused him of being involved in something illegal, threatened to go to police. He claimed he tried to calm her, but she pushed him. He pushed back, and she fell, hitting her head on the corner of a marble table. He said it was an accident. He said he panicked. He said he called Tariq because he didn't know what else to do, because if police found out his career would be over, his family disgraced, and he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. He said he was young, scared, and made a terrible mistake. He said he lived with guilt every day since, that he tried to move on, but the memory of Naomi's face never left him. He said he was sorry. Clara sat perfectly still as she listened, expression unreadable. When prosecution asked Adrian why he waited 14 years to confess, why he allowed Naomi's family to suffer in silence for so long, Adrian's composure finally cracked. He said he wanted to come forward, but was advised by superiors that doing so would create an international incident, would damage diplomatic relations, that it was better for everyone if the matter was left alone. He said he was told Naomi's death was unfortunate, but the greater good required him to stay silent. The prosecutor asked if he believed protecting his career was more important than giving a mother closure. Adrian didn't answer. He just looked down at his hands and said nothing. The verdict was delivered on December 18, 2024. Adrian Close was found guilty of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some felt the sentence too lenient, that a man who stole a life and hid truth for 14 years deserved far more. Others felt justice had finally been served, that Adrian would spend the next decade behind bars stripped of privileges and protections that had shielded him. Clara didn't react. She simply stood, gathered her things, and walked out, face expressionless. Outside, a crowd of reporters waited, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, voices calling questions. Clara stopped and faced them and for a moment said nothing. Then she spoke, voice steady and clear. She said the verdict didn't bring Naomi back. She said no amount of prison time would undo 14 years of pain her family endured. But she said the trial exposed something that needed exposing, that diplomatic immunity had been used as a tool to silence justice, and that Adrian's conviction was proof no one, no matter their status, should be above the law. She said she hoped Naomi's case would lead to changes in how diplomatic immunity was applied, that other families wouldn't have to fight as long and as hard as she had to get answers. She said Naomi's life mattered, that it had always mattered, and she would spend the rest of her own life making sure the world didn't forget that. The case became a turning point in international discussions about diplomatic immunity. In months following Adrian's conviction, several countries began reviewing their policies, exploring ways to create exceptions for serious crimes. The United Nations held hearings on the topic, inviting legal experts, human rights advocates, and families affected by crimes committed under diplomatic protection. Clara testified at one of these hearings, telling Naomi's story in full, describing years of bureaucratic walls and political silence, frustration of knowing who was responsible but being unable to do anything. Her testimony was widely covered in media and sparked renewed debates about whether the system designed to protect diplomats from harassment had become a loophole allowing the guilty to escape justice. In 2015, a former Dubai police officer, the same Lieutenant Rashid al-Mansouri, who had handled Naomi's initial case, came forward with new information. He had retired years earlier and was living in Canada, far from political pressures that once constrained him. In an interview with an investigative journalist, Rashid admitted he'd been ordered to close Naomi's case by superiors, told explicitly that pursuing the investigation would damage diplomatic relations and create problems for government. He said he was given a list of people not to be questioned, and Adrian Close's name had been on that list. Rashid said he struggled with the decision, knew Naomi's family deserved answers, but ultimately obeyed orders because he had a family of his own to protect and a career that could be destroyed if he defied superiors. His confession was met with outrage but also seen as evidence of how deeply systemic the problem was, how even well-intentioned officers could be trapped by a system that prioritized political considerations over justice. Rashid expressed deep remorse for his role and pledged to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. His testimony provided crucial corroboration for evidence gathered against Adrian and others, helping fill gaps that had remained mysteries for years. By late 2025, a total of 7 individuals had been charged in connection with Naomi Clarke's death and subsequent cover-up. In addition to Adrian Close, there were 2 other men who'd been at the party and helped dispose of Naomi's body, a former Dubai official who accepted bribes to suppress investigation, and 3 individuals who provided false statements or destroyed evidence. The trials were expected to continue for years as each case involved complex international legal issues and required cooperation between multiple countries. But the fact charges had been filed at all was seen as a major victory, a sign that the wall of silence protecting these individuals was finally crumbling. Clara Clarke didn't attend every trial. She had spent 14 years consumed by the fight for justice and was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. She had given everything to this cause, and now with Adrian behind bars and others facing charges, she allowed herself to step back, to focus on healing, To try to rebuild some semblance of a life, she started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art classes to young people, sharing the same love of creativity Naomi once had. She found comfort in the work, in laughter of children, in the simple act of helping someone create something beautiful. It didn't erase pain, but gave her a reason to get up in the morning, a reminder that life could still hold moments of joy even after unimaginable loss. In June 2025, on what would have been Naomi's 36th birthday, Clara organized a memorial event in London. It was held in a community center in Brixton, the same place where Naomi had spent her childhood attending art classes and youth programs. The walls were covered with photographs of Naomi at different stages of her life, from a gap-toothed little girl holding a paintbrush to a confident young woman in her university graduation gown. There were paintings Naomi created during her art history studies, essays she'd written, letters she'd sent to friends and family. It was a celebration of who Naomi had been, not just a victim of a crime, but a person with dreams and talents and a future that had been stolen. Hundreds attended. Some had known Naomi personally, while others had only learned about her through media coverage. They came to pay respects, to show support for Clara, to add their voices to the growing chorus demanding justice for victims of diplomatic crimes. There were speeches from human rights activists, from members of parliament who pledged to push for legal reforms, from other families who'd lost loved ones to similar circumstances. At the end, Clara stood at the front and thanked everyone for coming. She said Naomi had loved art because she believed it had the power to tell stories that words couldn't, to capture emotions too big for language. She said Naomi's story was now part of a larger narrative, a story about the fight for justice, the refusal to accept that some people are above accountability, and the belief that every life, no matter how it ends, deserves to be honored and remembered. Clara also began writing a book about her experience, a memoir detailing the 14-year journey from Naomi's disappearance to Adrian's conviction. She wrote about frustration of dealing with indifferent bureaucracies, heartbreak of false leads and dead ends, moments when she wanted to give up but forced herself to keep going. She wrote about people who helped along the way, journalists who kept Naomi's story alive, investigators who worked tirelessly despite having no official authority, strangers who sent letters of support and donations to cover legal fees. And she wrote about Naomi, not as a victim but as the vibrant, curious, compassionate person she'd been, the daughter who loved art and history and adventure, who wanted to see the world and make a difference in it. The book was published in early 2026, titled Above the Law, A Mother's Fight for Justice. It became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages, and sparked renewed interest in Naomi's case. Clara used proceeds to establish the Naomi Clarke Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families affected by crimes committed under diplomatic immunity, providing legal assistance, advocacy resources, and emotional support. The foundation also worked to lobby for legal reforms, partnering with other advocacy groups to push for changes at international level. Adrian Close began serving his sentence in a German prison in early 2025. Reports from inside suggested he kept to himself, spent most time reading and writing letters, requested protective custody because of threats from other inmates. Clara didn't care what happened to him behind those walls. She had no interest in his rehabilitation, no desire to hear about his remorse. As far as she was concerned, he'd already taken more from her than he could ever repay, and no amount of time in prison would balance that equation. The investigation into other individuals at the party continued. David Hassan, working with international law enforcement agencies, identified several other guests who witnessed what happened to Naomi or were involved in the cover-up. Some had diplomatic immunity at the time, but like Adrian, many had since left their positions and were no longer protected. Arrest warrants were issued, extradition requests filed, and slowly, piece by piece, the full picture of what happened that night began to emerge. It wasn't just one man who caused Naomi's death. It was a network of people who prioritized their own interests over the life of a young woman, who used power and connections to erase evidence, silence witnesses, and bury truth. By 2026, discussions about reforming diplomatic immunity had gained real momentum. Multiple countries proposed changes to their domestic laws, and the United Nations began drafting guidelines that would create exceptions to immunity in cases of serious violent crimes. The changes wouldn't come quickly, and they wouldn't be perfect, but they were a start. Clara knew real systemic change took years, sometimes decades, but she also knew that every conversation, every policy discussion, every public hearing was an opportunity to make sure what happened to Naomi would be less likely to happen to someone else. Naomi Clarke's story didn't end with her death. It became a rallying cry, a symbol of the failures of a system that prioritizes power over truth. And while Clara would never get her daughter back, she ensured Naomi's name would be remembered. that her case would serve as a warning, a reminder that silence is complicity, and that sometimes the only way to break through a wall of injustice is to keep pushing, year after year, until it finally cracks. The fight for justice isn't always won in courtrooms or through laws. Sometimes it's won by mothers who refuse to let their children be forgotten, by families who refuse to accept that some lives matter less than others, by people who understand that real change happens not because systems decide to be better, but because ordinary people demand it and refuse to stop demanding it until something finally gives. Clarke spent 14 years of her life fighting a system that was designed to defeat her. She won not because the system decided to be fair, but because she refused to accept defeat. And in doing so, she changed not just her own story, but the stories of countless others who came after, who would now have a precedent to point to, a name to invoke, a reminder that even when the odds are impossible, even when power seems untouchable, justice is still worth fighting for. Because in the end, Naomi's life mattered, and Clara made sure the world would never forget that.